Mother, I am his new bride. Why are you standing with her?
Because she is the only person here I call my daughter.
What kind of mother pushes past her son's brand new bride in front of 40 guests, a priest, and 6 armed men, just to hug the woman he divorced 3 months ago? That's not a rhetorical question. That actually happened. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why, because the reason is worse and sadder and more twisted than anything you're guessing right now. Before I go further, if you've ever had someone in your family choose the wrong side and later found out they were right the whole time, stick around, because stories I tell are basically built for people like you. Subscribe if that's you. Now let's get into it. There's a kind of loyalty that has nothing to do with blood. Everybody says family is family, but real ones know that's not always true. Sometimes the person who protects you isn't the one who shares your last name. Sometimes it's the one who shows up when nobody's watching and never once brings it up again. That's the kind of story this is. Not a love story, not really, a loyalty story. Quick question before I keep going. Where are you watching this from tonight? Drop it in the comments. And tell me what the weather's like where you are, because where this story is happening, it's the kind of cold that makes people say things they've been holding in for years. Her name was Amaka Chukwu. This is the story of how a woman who was erased from a family, quietly, legally, with a signature and a lawyer's smile, ended up being the only person that family's matriarch called my daughter in front of everyone who mattered. Not the new bride standing 3 feet away in a gown that cost more than most people's yearly rent. Amaka, the one they'd already thrown out. Picture this, front steps of a private estate in Seoul, 2 rows of family, all dressed for a celebration. A mother, 71 years old, silver hair pinned the traditional way, standing at the top of the stairs with her hands folded, waiting to greet her son's fiancé properly, the way custom demands. And then a black woman in a plain dark coat, no jewelry, walks up those same steps like she has every right to be there. And the mother doesn't wait for an introduction. She walks straight past the bride and wraps her arms around the ex-wife like she's been waiting years to do exactly that. That's the moment, that's where we start. Everything else I'm about to tell you is how we got there. But let me back up, because you need to understand who Amaka was before any of this, back when she still believed the ending was going to be a happy one. She was 26 when she came to Korea. An engineer, not the kind of woman anyone expected to end up connected to one of Seoul's most powerful and most feared families. She'd been hired on a restoration contract, brought in because the Beek family's century-old ancestral house was sinking on one side and every local firm had turned the job down, said the risk wasn't worth the money. Amaka didn't turn it down. She liked problems other people were scared of. She believed in doing the work right even when nobody was checking. She believed loyalty was something you proved with your actions, not your last name. She believed that if you took care of people quietly, without needing credit for it, that was the whole point. She was the kind of woman who gave everything and never once kept score. And somewhere in the 8 months she spent inside that house, rebuilding its foundation floor by floor, she fell in love with the man who would one day divorce her with a single signature and a lawyer standing behind him the entire time. His name was Beek Jinwoo, heir to a family whose business dealings existed in the exact space between legitimate and you don't ask questions. Here's the part I need you to sit with for a second, because it matters for everything that comes later. 3 years into their marriage, something happened inside that family that Amaka was never publicly credited for. Something that put her directly between a 14-year-old girl and a car that was never supposed to stop moving. I'm not telling you what it was yet, not because I'm trying to be dramatic, because the family itself didn't know the full truth for years either. Somebody made sure of that. What I will tell you is this. 90 days after that incident, Amaka was handed divorce papers. Everyone in the family was told the same story, that the marriage simply hadn't worked, that it was mutual, that it was clean and respectful, and nobody's fault. That story was a lie, and the only 2 people who knew exactly how big a lie it was were sitting in that room on the day this story opens. One of them was the mother standing at the top of those stairs. The other one hadn't said a word about it in 3 years. So when Madame Beek walked past her son's new fiancée and pulled the woman he divorced into her arms in front of everyone, it wasn't sentiment. It wasn't nostalgia. It was 71 years of composure finally breaking under the weight of something she'd been carrying alone. And somewhere in that crowd, a woman in an ivory dress was already doing the math, already deciding this humiliation would not go unanswered. That's where we are headed. Stick with me. I need you to understand something about Jinwoo before you decide how you feel about him, because it's easy to hear mafia air and picture a man who never doubted himself for a second. That wasn't him, not back then. He was 29 when he met Amaka, already carrying the weight of being the only son of a family that didn't really believe in sons who asked questions. His father had died when he was 22, which meant Jinwoo inherited a seat at the table years before he was ready for the room. Everyone around him had an opinion about who he should be. Nobody asked who he actually wanted to become. Amaka never asked him to be anything. That was the first thing that undid him. She showed up to survey the ancestral house in work boots and a hard hat, climbed through a crawl space nobody else on her crew wanted to touch, and told him flatly that the east wing was going to collapse within 2 years if nobody fixed the drainage first. Jinwoo had sat through a dozen meetings with contractors who talked around problems instead of namming them. Amaka named everything. He found that unbearably attractive in a way he didn't have words for yet. Their relationship built slowly, the way real ones do. Late dinners after she'd finished a 12-hour day on site. Her asking him actual questions about the business, not to pry, but because she wanted to understand the man, not just the title. Him watching her argue with senior engineers twice her age and win every time because she'd done the math and they hadn't. Madame Beek noticed her son changing before he noticed it himself. Jinwoo started sleeping better. He stopped drinking the way he used to after difficult meetings. He laughed, actually laughed, not the polite version he performed for guests. Madame Beek watched all of this from a distance for months before she ever said a word to Amaka directly. The first real conversation between them happened in the garden near a koi pond Jinwoo's late father had built. Madame Beek asked Amaka one question. Do you understand what you are walking into if you stay? Amaka didn't flinch. I understand what I'm walking into every time I climb into a building that's about to fall down. I still climb in. Madame Beek didn't smile easily. She smiled then. They married 18 months later, and for a while, a real while, not a performance of one, it was good. Amaka moved into the family compound. She kept working, kept taking contracts, refused every attempt to turn her into a decorative wife who existed to be photographed at events. Jinwoo's mother respected that more than she ever said out loud. But there's always someone in a story like this who's been waiting quietly for an opening, and in this family, that person was Han Jae-seok. Jae-seok had been the Beek family's legal counsel for 18 years. He'd advised Jinwoo's father. He considered himself the true architect of the family's stability, the man who'd kept them out of prison and out of the papers more times than anyone would ever know. He was not a cruel man. That's important. He genuinely believed he was protecting the family. That belief was exactly what made him dangerous. Jae-seok never trusted Amaka, not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented, an outsider with no ties to the network of families and obligations that had kept the Beeks safe for 2 generations. He watched her gain influence with Madame Beek and felt something close to alarm. Not jealousy exactly, something more like a man watching a structure he'd spent his life reinforcing suddenly develop a crack he hadn't accounted for. For the first 2 years of the marriage, that alarm stayed quiet. Amaka gave him nothing to work with. She was careful, competent, and impossible to catch doing anything wrong, because she wasn't doing anything wrong. Then came Jinwoo's younger sister. Her name was Ha-yoon, 14 years old when this part of the story happens, sharp-tongued and stubborn in a way that reminded everyone of her late father. Ha-yoon adored Amaka in the specific, fierce way only a younger sibling can adore an older sister-in-law who actually listens to her instead of managing her. Amaka picked her up from school sometimes when the family driver was busy. Amaka helped her with the physics homework nobody else in the house could explain properly. It was small. It was ordinary. It was the kind of quiet family life Amaka had built for herself brick by brick, the same way she built everything else. I want you to notice something here, because this is the part that matters later. Ha-Yoon's safety was never supposed to be a business problem. She wasn't part of any deal, any rivalry, any negotiation. She was a teenager who liked terrible pop music and was embarrassed by her own family's reputation. But in a family like the Beeks, nothing stays separate from the business for long. Not even a 14-year-old girl's ride home from school. A rival organization, the Cho Network, had been circling the Beek family's shipping contracts for over a year, looking for leverage anywhere they could find it. Jae-seok knew about the tension. Jinwoo knew about it in general terms, the way you know a storm is somewhere on the horizon without knowing exactly when it lands. Nobody thought to warn Amaka because nobody thought Amaka needed warning. She wasn't blood. She wasn't a target. That was the assumption that nearly got a 14-year-old girl killed. If you've ever been the outsider in a family who ended up protecting people the actual family members should have protected, I want to hear that in the comments, because that's exactly the position Amaka was about to be put in, without anyone asking her first. Here's the thing about the day everything changed. It started completely ordinary. Amaka picked Ha-Yoon up from a tutoring session near Gangnam, the same route she'd driven a dozen times before. Nothing about that afternoon should have been different from any other Tuesday. But somebody had been watching that route for 3 weeks, and they weren't watching for Amaka at all. The car came from the wrong angle, which is the first thing that told Amaka something was off, because in 8 months of driving that route, she'd never once seen traffic move that way. A black SUV pulled alongside them at the intersection near the tutoring center, matched their speed instead of passing, and stayed there 1 second too long. Amaka had grown up in Lagos. She knew what it looked like when a vehicle wasn't behaving like traffic, it was behaving like intent. She didn't panic, that's not who she was. She did what she'd trained herself to do on every job site she'd ever worked. She assessed the exits before she assessed the danger. There was a service alley 2 blocks up that construction crews used to access a building she'd surveyed the year before. She knew it had a gate that locked from the inside. Ha-Yoon, seatbelt tight, hold onto the door, she said, and turned before the SUV could react. What happened over the next 4 minutes never made it into any police report, because the Beek family made sure nothing about that afternoon ever reached a police report. Amaka drove through a service alley meant for delivery trucks, clipped a dumpster hard enough to dent the passenger door, and got the gate closed and locked behind them 11 seconds before the SUV reached it. Ha-Yoon was screaming. Amaka wasn't. She called Jinwoo's head of security from a number she'd memorized for exactly this kind of situation, though she'd never once expected to use it. Security arrived 9 minutes later. By then the SUV was gone. Ha-Yoon had a cut above her eyebrow from where she'd hit the door frame, nothing serious, nothing that needed more than a bandage. Physically, both of them were fine. That should have been the end of the story. A close call. A family that tightens security and moves on grateful nobody got hurt. It wasn't the end, because the Cho Network, the same rival organization that had been circling the Beek shipping contracts, claimed responsibility the next morning through a private channel Jae-seok had spent years cultivating for exactly this kind of message. Not a ransom demand, not even really a threat, just a message sent directly to Jae-seok, letting him know they'd found a way in. That the family's security had a hole big enough for a car to drive through, and that hole had almost cost them the boss's little sister. Jinwoo's understandable motivation in what happened next isn't hard to explain, and I don't say that to excuse him, I say it because pretending he had none would make the rest of this story make less sense. He was terrified, not for himself, for Ha-Yoon, and increasingly, in a way he couldn't fully separate from the fear, for what it meant that his family's enemies now knew exactly how close they could get. Jae-seok used that fear the way he'd used every crisis in 18 years of protecting this family, carefully, patiently, and with total conviction that he was doing the right thing. His argument to Jinwoo delivered over 3 private meetings across 2 weeks, went like this. The Cho network hadn't targeted Ha-yoon randomly. They'd targeted the car Amaka was driving, on a route Amaka drove regularly, at a time Amaka's schedule made predictable. Which meant, Jae-seok argued, that Amaka's presence in the family, an outsider with no protective network of her own, no family alliances to draw on, nothing but her own competence standing between herself and men who'd been planning that ambush for weeks, had made Ha-yoon a softer target than she'd ever been before. It wasn't true. Ha-yoon had been a target because she was Jin-woo's sister, full stop, with or without Amaka in the car that day. But grief and fear make people receptive to explanations that hand them somewhere to put the blame, and Jae-seok knew exactly how to hand a frightened man an explanation shaped like a solution. The evidence Jin-woo should have seen and missed was simple, and it was sitting right in front of him the entire time. Amaka was the reason Ha-yoon walked away with a bandage instead of something far worse. Every decision she'd made in those 4 minutes had been fast, correct, and had saved his sister's life. Jae-seok never once mentioned that part in any of the 3 meetings. He built his entire case around the ambush happening and left out, deliberately, who had gotten them both out of it alive. Jin-woo signed the papers 11 days later. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself it was to protect Amaka as much as Ha-yoon, that separating her from the family publicly would take her out of any future crosshairs, that once the Cho situation cooled down he'd find a way to fix things quietly, privately, the way his family fixed everything. He believed this the way people believe things that let them avoid an unbearable conversation. He never had that conversation with Amaka. Jae-seok handled the delivery of the papers personally, framed it to her as a family council decision, final and unanimous, no room for negotiation. He never told her Jin-woo hadn't wanted this. He never told her the truth about why it was happening at all. He let her believe, for 3 years, that the man she loved had simply decided she wasn't worth protecting. That was the lie that would end up costing Jae-seok everything, though none of them knew it yet. And here's the detail that's going to matter more than anything else in this story, so hold on to it. Madame Beek was in Busan the week the divorce was finalized, attending to a family matter that had nothing to do with any of this. By the time she came home, it was already done, signed, filed, presented to her as settled fact. She didn't find out what actually happened that day in the alley, the real version, not Jae-seok's version, until 8 months later. And when she did, she never said a single word to her son about it. She went looking for Amaka instead. Madame Beek found Amaka living in a small rented apartment in Itaewon, still doing engineering contracts, still refusing to let anyone's version of her story become her own. It took her 3 weeks of asking quiet questions through people who owed her favors to even get the address. Amaka hadn't made herself hard to find out of spite. She'd made herself hard to find because she couldn't stand the idea of being somewhere Jin-woo could reach if he changed his mind, and she'd decided a long time ago that she'd rather not know if he never did. The first meeting between them was short. Madame Beek didn't apologize, not that day. She asked one question, the same kind of direct question she'd asked in the garden years earlier. Tell me exactly what happened in that alley, not what Jae-seok told the family, what actually happened. Amaka told her, all 4 minutes of it, in order, without embellishment, the way she'd have given a report on any job site. Madame Beek sat with that information for a long time before she spoke again. Then she said something Amaka never expected to hear from her. You saved my granddaughter's life, and my family repaid you by erasing you from it. I want you to understand that I did not know. And I want you to understand that knowing changes nothing that has already been done to you, but I am not going to let it stay hidden. What Madame Beek did next, she did without telling her son. Every week after that, without fail, she found a reason to see Amaka. Sometimes it was framed as consulting her on a renovation. Sometimes it was simply tea. She never told Jin-woo. She never told Jae-seok. For 3 years, mother and ex-daughter-in-law built something private and real in the space everyone else assumed was empty. Meanwhile, Jin-woo's life moved forward on the surface the way everyone expected it to. He threw himself into the business with the specific intensity of a man trying not to think about something. 2 years after the divorce, he was introduced through a mutual business contact to Yu Narai, a former television anchor with a polished public image and a family name respectable enough to photograph well next to the Beeks. Here's what nobody in that introduction knew, including Jinwoo. Narai's family owed a significant, nagging debt to the Cho network, the same organization behind the attack on Ha-yoon 3 years earlier. Not the kind of debt you pay off with money, the kind you pay off with access. Narai hadn't set out to fall into that arrangement. Her father had made the deal a decade earlier, long before she had any say in it, borrowing against a business that failed anyway, leaving the debt behind like an inheritance nobody asked for. By the time she was old enough to understand what her family owed, the Cho network had already decided exactly how she'd repay it: marry well, marry connected, and pass along whatever she learned. She was, in her own way, as trapped as Amaka had once been in a family that used people without asking their permission first. That distinction matters, and I want you to hold on to it, because it's easy to make Narai simply the villain here. She's more complicated than that, but complicated doesn't mean harmless. For the first year of dating Jinwoo, Narai gave the Cho network almost nothing, vague impressions, nothing operational, telling herself she was managing the arrangement rather than participating in it. But engagement changes access. Once she moved into planning conversations about the wedding, about family events, about which security details would be present where and when, the information she had access to became worth something real. And the people she owed had a very long memory for exactly how much someone owed them. Jae-seok, for his part, spent those same 3 years quietly congratulating himself on a crisis handled. Ha-yoon was safe. The family's image was intact. Jinwoo's marriage to Narai, from Jae-seok's perspective, represented exactly the kind of stable, image-conscious union the family needed after the disruption of the divorce. He had no idea what Narai actually was. He'd run a background check that came back clean, because on paper it was clean. Jae-seok had spent his whole career protecting the family from threats he could see coming. He'd never learned to look for the ones that had already been sitting across the dinner table for a year. 2 weeks before the engagement blessing, the ceremony where this story opened, where Madame Beek walked past Narai and embraced Amaka in front of 43 relatives. Madame Beek received something that changed the timeline of everything she'd been quietly planning. A contact she'd cultivated for decades, a woman with connections deep inside Seoul's private security circuit, passed her a piece of information almost in passing, the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows. Yu Narai's family had an old, unresolved debt to the Cho network, the same Cho network that had nearly gotten Ha-yoon killed. Madame Beek did not tell her son, not yet. She'd learned, 3 years earlier, exactly what happened when this family made irreversible decisions out of fear instead of certainty. She wanted proof before she handed Jinwoo something that would break him. So she did the one thing that made sense to a woman who trusted almost no one in her own household anymore. She called Amaka. If you've made it this far, you already know something's about to blow this whole family apart, and I promise you, what happens at that engagement blessing is only the beginning of it. Subscribe now if you don't want to miss where this goes next, because the reveal in the next act is the one this entire story has been building toward. Amaka didn't hesitate when Madame Beek called. 3 years of quiet tea and quiet trust had built something between them that didn't need long explanations. Madame Beek told her what she suspected about Narai's family debt and asked one thing: not for Amaka to confront anyone, not for Amaka to warn Jinwoo, just for her professional eyes on something. A set of financial documents tied to a Cho network shell company that had recently acquired a minority stake in a private security firm. The same firm the Beek family had just hired to handle event security for the engagement blessing. Amaka spent 4 nights going through those documents the way she went through structural surveys, methodically, without emotion, looking for the load-bearing failure hidden underneath something that looked stable on the surface. What she found wasn't a smoking gun. It was worse, in its own way, because it was patient. The shell company had been acquiring small, boring stakes in companies connected to the Beek family's operations for over a year. Not enough in any single acquisition to raise alarm. Enough altogether to put Cho Network money and Cho Network access inside 3 separate points of the Beek family's daily security. Right at the moment Jinwoo's engagement made those points more predictable than they'd ever been. And threaded through 2 of the shell company's board filings, listed as a minor liaison contact, was a name Amaka recognized from society pages she'd stopped reading 3 years ago. Yu Narai's older brother. Here's what you have to understand about what happened next, because it's the moment this story stopped being about a family drama and became about something with real stakes attached. Madame Beek now had 2 devastating truths sitting in front of her at the exact same time, and she had to decide what to do with both of them before the engagement blessing, which was 5 days away. The first truth: her son's fiancé's family was financially entangled with the organization that had nearly killed her granddaughter. The second truth, the one that had been sitting quietly underneath everything for 3 years, was one Amaka herself surfaced almost by accident, flipping back through an old family ledger Madame Beek had brought along out of habit. Buried in a footnote of a legal transfer from 3 years earlier, the same week the divorce was finalized, was a disbursement authorized by Jae-seok, moving a substantial sum from a family discretionary account into what was labeled, vaguely, as a settlement and relocation fund. Amaka had never received a settlement. She'd never received a single one from that family after the divorce, by her own choice, because she hadn't wanted anything that looked like she'd been paid to disappear, which meant that money had gone somewhere else. It took 2 more days of quiet digging, using a forensic accountant Amaka trusted from an old engineering client, to trace where the money had funded, almost to the exact figure, Jae-seok's daughter's tuition and relocation to a graduate program in the United States, timed within 6 weeks of the divorce. Jae-seok hadn't just pushed Jinwoo toward ending the marriage out of misguided protectiveness. He'd profited from it, quietly, deniably, in a way that would look, to anyone who found it later, like an unrelated family expense paid from an account he had full discretionary authority over. He'd used a crisis involving a 14-year-old girl's safety to manufacture a decision that served his own family's finances, and he'd let Jinwoo believe, for 3 years, that he'd made a noble sacrifice to protect the people he loved. Madame Beek sat with both documents spread on the table in front of her, in the same tea room where she'd once asked Amaka to tell her the truth about the alley, and said something Amaka would remember for the rest of her life. I trusted him with my son's entire life for 18 years, and in the one moment that mattered most, I wasn't even in the room. There was no version of this where Madame Beek could simply confront Jae-seok privately and let it end there anymore, because 5 days from now, her son was going to stand in front of 43 relatives and formally bind his family to a woman whose own family owed a debt to the exact organization that had already tried once to hurt this family through the people it loved most. If Madame Beek said nothing and let the engagement proceed, she'd be repeating the same mistake Jae-seok had made 3 years earlier, protecting the family's image instead of protecting the family. If she said everything, publicly, immediately, she risked exposing Ha-yoon to renewed danger the moment the Cho network realized their access had been discovered, and she risked destroying her son in front of the entire family before he'd had any chance to understand what was actually happening around him. She chose a third option, the one nobody in that family had seen her choose before, not once in 40 years of being the person who held all of it together by staying quiet and controlled. She decided to bring Amaka back into the house herself, publicly, undeniably, on the one day nobody could pretend not to notice, the engagement blessing itself, not to disrupt the ceremony for its own sake, to force a reckoning she could no longer put off, on her own terms, with Amaka standing beside her instead of Jae-seok for the first time in 3 years. That's the moment the whole video opened on. Now you know what was underneath it. Before we go further, I want to know something from you directly in the comments below. If you found out someone you trusted for 18 years had built one of the worst decisions of your life around protecting their own money, would you expose them publicly the way Madam Beak was about to, or would you have found a quieter way to make them pay? I'll be reading every answer. Because what Madam Beak did after that embrace on the front steps is where this story goes from a family secret to something none of them could fully control anymore. Stick around for that part. It's coming next. Inside the mansion, tea had gone cold in every cup in the room. Jinwoo sat frozen on the low couch beside Narai, his mother's words from earlier still hanging in the air. In a moment, Jinwoo, two words that had never once, in 34 years, been said to him by a woman who prided herself on never making anyone wait. Madam Beak didn't drag it out. She decided that much in advance, no theater, no slow reveal designed to maximize the room's shock. She placed the two documents on the low table in front of her son, one at a time, and let him read them in silence. The first was the disbursement record. Jae-seok's signature, the discretionary account, the tuition payment timed 6 weeks after the divorce. Jinwoo read it twice. His face didn't change the way you'd expect. It went very still, the specific stillness of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't want to finish. Uncle Jae-seok told me the divorce protected her, he said quietly. He told me it protected Ha-yoon. It protected his daughter's tuition, Madam Beak said. That's what it protected. Jae-seok, seated 3 chairs down as he always was in this room, did not deny it. That was the detail that told Jinwoo everything he still needed to know. A man who spends 18 years being careful doesn't stay silent by accident. He stays silent because he's already calculating what comes next, and denial isn't on the list of things that will save him. The second document took longer to land because it wasn't about Jae-seok at all. Madam Beak explained plainly what Amaka had found in the shell company filings, the Cho network money threaded through the security firm hired for tonight's event, and the name buried in the paperwork, Narai's brother. Narai's teacup didn't rattle this time. She set it down on its saucer with a control that told you exactly how long she'd been preparing for a version of this moment, even if she hadn't known precisely when it would come. I never gave them anything that mattered, she said. Her voice didn't shake. Not until the engagement. You have to understand what my family owed, what I owed before I ever knew you. Jinwoo looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger who's been sitting across from him for a year. What did you give them, Narai? Say it plainly. She did guest lists, security rotation schedules for family events, including, she admitted, tonight's. Nothing about Ha-yoon specifically. She was careful to make that distinction, and later, when everything was verified, it turned out to be true. But schedules and rotations were exactly the kind of information that had let a black SUV know precisely which route a 14-year-old girl's car would take 3 years earlier, and everyone in that room understood the shape of what she was describing even before she finished saying it. This is where the story could have gone the way stories like this usually go, Jinwoo standing up in righteous fury, throwing Narai and Jae-seok both out of the house, calling the police, ending the night in handcuffs and headlines. Some part of him wanted exactly that. Every rule he'd been raised on told him that was the correct response to betrayal at this scale. But he'd learned something in the 3 years since the divorce, even if he hadn't understood he was learning it at the time. Loud consequences had a way of landing on the people who could least afford them. If this became a police matter, if this became a headline, the Cho network would know within hours that their access had been discovered, and the first thing an organization like that does when its leverage gets burned is remove the evidence of how it was obtained. Which in this case meant Narai, and possibly meant Ha-yoon all over again. Jinwoo stood up. He did not raise his voice. Every syllable came out controlled in a way that frightened the room more than shouting would have. Nobody in this house is calling the police tonight, he said. Not because anyone here doesn't deserve consequences. Because the moment we make this public, we lose the ability to control what happens to the people I'm responsible for protecting. He turned to Jae-seok. You have until morning to give me everything, every account, every transfer, every conversation you've had with anyone outside this family about my marriage in the last 3 years. If what you give me matches what I already have, you keep your name on the family register and you retire quietly. If it doesn't, I go to the prosecutor myself, and I let your daughter's tuition records speak for you in court." Jae-seok said nothing. He simply nodded once, and the 18 years of authority he'd carried in that room visibly left him in that single motion. Narai he turned to last. And here the story took the sharpest turn of the entire night, because Jinwoo did not treat her the way the room expected him to. "You were trapped in a debt you didn't create, the same way I was trapped in a decision I didn't fully choose 3 years ago," he said. "That doesn't erase what you gave them, but I understand it better than anyone in this room might expect me to." The engagement ended that night, quietly, without a scene, without a single photograph making it to any tabloid, because Jinwoo made sure of that too. But the cost of the evening wasn't finished landing yet. Hyun, 17 now, had been listening from the hallway the entire time, the way teenagers in houses like this always find a way to hear the things they're supposed to be shielded from. She came into the room afterward, and what she said to Amaka, the woman who'd driven through a locked gate 3 years earlier to keep her alive, the woman she'd been forbidden by unspoken family rule from mentioning since, undid something in Amaka that 3 years of careful composure had held together. "You never told me why you stopped coming," Hyun said. "I thought you didn't want to anymore." Amaka had spent 3 years believing she'd protected that girl once, and then simply been erased from her life by a family that decided she wasn't worth keeping. She hadn't let herself imagine that Hyun had spent those same 3 years believing Amaka had chosen to leave. That was the moment it stopped feeling like vindication and started feeling like grief. Not for what had been exposed that night. For the 3 years nobody could get back, not Amaka's relationship with Hyun, not whatever Jinwoo and Amaka might have still had if a frightened man hadn't signed a paper 11 days after the worst afternoon of his life. Madame Beek watched her granddaughter, and the woman she'd quietly kept close for 3 years, standing in the same room again, and understood, finally, exactly how much had been lost, while she'd been trying to fix it carefully instead of quickly. If you've ever gotten the truth you'd been waiting years for, only to realize the truth couldn't actually give you back the time it cost you, I think you already know where this story is headed next. It's not over, it's just getting to the part that actually matters. Jinwoo didn't sleep that night. He walked the mansion grounds the way he had once, years earlier, in a version of himself that already felt distant to him now, past the koi pond his father built, out to the stone bench near the cherry tree his mother used to sit at when she needed to think without an audience. He sat there for 2 hours in the cold, holding nothing this time, no photograph, no evidence, just the weight of everything he'd learned in a single night. Amaka found him there past midnight. She wasn't looking for him. She'd stepped outside to get air after the conversation with Hyun had left her raw in a way she hadn't expected, and the bench happened to be where the path took her. She almost turned back when she saw him. She didn't. "I'm not here to comfort you," she said. "I didn't ask you to be." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the same silence that had sat in that tea room 3 years ago, thick with things neither of them would say. This one had room in it. "Did you know," Jinwoo finally asked, "before tonight, did you know what Jae-seok did?" "No, I found the transfer record 4 nights ago when your mother asked me to look at something else entirely. I didn't come here tonight to expose him. I came because your mother asked me to, and I owed her that much." "You didn't owe her anything." "I owed her everything," Amaka said. "She's the only person in this family who ever asked me the truth and then believed it." Jinwoo looked at his hands for a long moment. "I signed those papers 11 days after the worst afternoon of my life, because a man I trusted for 18 years told me it would protect the people I loved. I never once asked you what actually happened in that alley. I never asked what it cost you to make that decision in 4 minutes with my sister screaming in the seat behind you. I just signed." "I know. I have been a coward," he said. "Not just about you, about Jae-seok. about every person who told me who to be instead of asking who I wanted to become. I believed them because believing them was easier than deciding anything for myself. Amaka didn't rush to comfort him or forgive him. That wasn't who she was, and 3 years of silence had taught her the difference between an apology and an actual change. "What do you want from me now?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I know what I want to give. I don't know if I've earned the right to ask for anything back." That answer, more than any grand declaration could have, was the first thing he'd said to her in 3 years that sounded like the man she'd once trusted with everything, rebuilding himself in real time instead of performing a version of recovery for an audience. "Then start with what you can give," she said. "Not to me, to Ha-yoon. She spent 3 years thinking I abandoned her because nobody in this family told her the truth. That's not something I can fix for her. Only this family can." He nodded slowly, understanding landing in stages. "And Madam Beek, my mother carried this alone for 3 years because she didn't trust that telling me the truth wouldn't destroy something before she had proof strong enough to act on. She trusted you enough to bring me back the way she did tonight," Amaka said. "In front of everyone. That was her risking everything on the hope that you'd become someone who could handle the truth instead of someone who needed to be protected from it." Something in Jinwoo's chest loosened at that, the specific relief of understanding that trust, even fractured trust, hadn't been fully withdrawn. It had just been waiting for something to prove itself against. The real turning point of that night didn't come from Amaka at all, though. It came the next morning, when Madam Beek called a private family meeting, not the full council, just Jinwoo, Ha-yoon and herself, and told her granddaughter, plainly and without softening it, the entire truth about the alley, about Jae-seok, about 3 years of silence that had cost a 17-year-old girl a relationship she'd never understood she'd lost. Ha-yoon cried for the first time anyone in that family had seen in years, not from the danger she'd finally learned the full shape of, but from the specific grief of realizing someone had loved her enough to nearly die keeping her safe, and the adults around her had been too careful, too controlled, too protective of the family's composure to ever let her know it. "I want to see her," Ha-yoon said. "Properly, not hallway conversations. I want her back." Madam Beek looked at her son. "That decision isn't only mine to make anymore, it's his too." Jinwoo understood, in that moment, that this wasn't a story where he got to decide how quickly everyone forgave him, or how fast the last 3 years could be repaired. Amaka had drawn a boundary in that garden conversation the night before without ever stating it outright. She would not be rushed back into anything for the sake of making the family feel resolved. If there was a way forward, it would happen at the pace of actual trust being rebuilt, not the pace of a family wanting its guilt relieved. He had a choice in front of him now, the real one this whole story had been building toward. He could go back to being the man Jae-seok had spent 18 years shaping, controlled, image-conscious, deciding things quietly on other people's behalf because it was cleaner that way. Or he could become the kind of man who let the people he'd hurt set the terms of what came next, even when it was slower and harder, and gave him no guarantee of the ending he wanted. He chose the second one, and that choice is what the rest of this story turns on. Jae-seok delivered everything he'd promised by morning, and true to his word, Jinwoo kept his end of it. The retirement was quiet, the transfer of his authority formal but private, no headlines, no prosecutor, no public account of 18 years ending in disgrace. But Jinwoo made one addition to the arrangement that hadn't been part of the original terms, and it was the one that mattered most. He called a family council meeting 2 weeks later, formal, all 31 voting members present, the way these things had always been done in the Beek family. Madam Beek sat at the head of the table. Jinwoo sat at her right. Jae-seok's seat, for the first time in 18 years, sat empty. Jinwoo didn't give a speech about betrayal. He didn't need to. He laid out 3 documents on the table: the disbursement record, a signed statement from Jae-seok acknowledging what the funds had actually paid for, and a third document nobody in the room expected: a formal proposal to establish an independent security review board for all family events going forward, with Amaka Chakwu named as its founding structural and operations consultant. That last part wasn't about optics. It was about the fact that 3 years earlier, this family's blind spot had nearly cost a 14-year-old her life, and the person who'd seen the danger clearly enough to get her out of it had been erased instead of listened to. Jinwoo wasn't going to make that mistake twice. The council approved it without debate. Nobody in that room, after everything they'd just seen, was inclined to argue. The engagement to Narai had already quietly ended, but there was one more conversation left to have, and Jinwoo insisted on having it himself rather than through any intermediary. He met her at a private tea house in Bukchon, away from any family property, away from anyone who might report back to anyone. "I'm not going to pretend what you did wasn't dangerous," he told her. "You gave people who'd already tried to hurt my sister a map to my family's schedule. I have to live with the fact that Ha-yoon could have paid for that." "I know," Narai said. She didn't defend herself further. She'd had 2 weeks to think about what she wanted to say, and none of it was an excuse. "I spent 10 years being told my worth to my own family was measured by what I could give someone else. I stopped noticing the difference between protecting myself and betraying people who trusted me. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth, and you deserve the truth even this late." Jinwoo believed her, and that belief was its own kind of complicated grief. Understanding that Narai had been shaped by the same kind of quiet family pressure that had shaped him, just aimed in a different direction. "What happens to you now," he asked, "with the Cho network, if they find out you've been cut off from us?" "I already went to the authorities 2 days ago," she said, quietly, "with a lawyer who isn't connected to either family. I gave them everything I know about the shell company structure. It's the only way I'll ever actually be free of the debt, instead of just passing it to someone else." It was, in its own way, the bravest thing anyone in this story had done, and Jinwoo told her so before they parted for the last time. She didn't become a villain who disappeared from the narrative in disgrace. She became someone who'd finally made a choice that was entirely her own, for the first time in a decade, even though it cost her almost everything to make it. That left one final piece of unfinished business, and it belonged entirely to Madame Beek. 3 weeks after the council meeting, she called the family together again, not the full council this time, just the 12 members who had stood on those front steps the night this story began, the ones who'd watched her walk past Narai without understanding why. They gathered in the mansion's oldest room, the one reserved for ceremonies too significant for the formal hall. Amaka stood at the front, dressed simply, no performance in it. Madame Beek spoke first, and her voice, usually so controlled, carried something rawer than anyone in that room had heard from her in years. 3 years ago, this family let a lie stand because the truth was inconvenient, and a woman who saved my granddaughter's life paid for our comfort with her place in this family. I did not act quickly enough once I learned the truth, and that delay cost all of us more than any of you know. Today I am correcting what should have been corrected the moment I understood it." She turned to Amaka. "I have asked the family registrar to formally record you as my daughter, not through marriage, not through any claim on my son, but through the truth of what you have been to this family for years, whether we deserved it or not. This is not conditional on anything that happens between you and Jinwoo going forward. It is simply what is true." Amaka, who had cried once 3 years ago and decided that was the last time she'd let this family see her break, found she couldn't hold that decision this time. She didn't need to. 12 members of the Beek family bowed to her the old way, the way reserved for correcting a debt of honor too significant for words alone to settle. Amaka bowed back, lower, the correct form, the one she'd learned during 2 years of actually living in this house. Then she said the only thing that felt necessary: "I accept this, and I ask one thing in return, that Ha-yoon is never again kept in the dark about something that changes her life for the sake of anyone's comfort. She deserved better 3 years ago. She deserves better going forward." Madame Beek nodded once, agreed. The family meeting ended quietly. There was no celebration, no music, no dramatic announcement. Just people leaving the room one by one, carrying the weight of everything they had finally learned. Amaka stayed behind with Madame Beek. For 3 years, that woman had been the closest thing she had to family. Now she had finally been given a place in that family without having to earn it. Madame Beek reached for her hand. "You should have been my daughter from the beginning." Amaka smiled through her tears. "I think I was. You just needed time to say it." Across the room, Jinwoo heard those words. He didn't interrupt. That was another thing he had learned. Not every moment needed him in the center. 3 years ago, he had made a decision for Amaka without asking what she wanted. Now, if he wanted any place in her future, he knew he had to let her choose it. And Amaka noticed. That mattered more than any apology. Over the next few months, the family began to change. Jae-seok disappeared from the daily operations of the Beek organization. His name was removed from the family council, and the financial records he had hidden were turned over for investigation. His greatest punishment wasn't prison. It was losing the trust he had spent 18 years building. Narai also walked away from the Beek family with her head held high. She had finally broken free from the debt that had controlled her life, and she cooperated with investigators against the Cho network. She wasn't forgiven for what she had done, but she was given the chance to become someone different. And that was enough. As for Ha-yoon, she became almost impossible to separate from Amaka again. She visited her office. She called her when she needed advice. And one afternoon, while the two of them were sitting together over coffee, Ha-yoon finally asked the question she had been carrying for 3 years. "Did you ever hate me?" Amaka looked at her. "Never. Even when you thought my family hated you." Amaka smiled sadly. "You were never your family." Ha-yoon reached across the table and hugged her. And this time, nobody pulled them apart. Jinwoo and Amaka did not immediately become husband and wife again. That would have been too easy. Instead, they started again. Slowly. Honestly. No family pressure. No contracts. No promises made for appearances. Just two people learning whether the love they had once shared could survive the truth. And this time, Jinwoo did things differently. When there was a problem, he asked. When he was afraid, he said so. And when Amaka needed space, he gave it. Months later, Amaka stood outside the Beek ancestral house again. The same steps where Madame Beek had once pulled her into an embrace in front of the entire family. But this time, she wasn't standing there as someone's ex-wife. She wasn't standing there as an outsider. She was standing there as family. Madame Beek opened the door herself. She smiled. "My daughter, you're late." Amaka laughed. "Your son kept me waiting." Madame Beek looked past her. Jinwoo was standing by the car. For once, he wasn't the feared heir. He was just a man waiting for the woman he loved. Amaka walked toward him. And before she reached the car, Jinwoo held out his hand. She took it. No promises about forever. No perfect ending. Just a choice. A choice they were both making freely this time. And maybe that was the real ending. Amaka had once been erased from a family with a signature. But she came back without begging for her place. She earned nothing. She owed nothing. She simply stood where she belonged. And the woman everyone thought could be discarded became the woman Madame Beek proudly called her daughter. So let me ask you this. If you were Amaka, would you have given Jinwoo another chance after everything he did? Or would 3 years of betrayal have been too much to forgive? Tell me in the comments. And if you stayed until the end, subscribe, because sometimes the person a family tries hardest to erase becomes the one person they can never replace. And Amaka's story may have ended here. But her new life with the Beek family was only beginning.